Poetry has traditionally followed various structures. I'm sure you've heard of the haiku, and maybe you've heard of the sestina or the villanelle, but the most famous of these very structured poems is the sonnet. So there are two common questions I have when I teach about sonnets. The first one is, why must we know sonnets? Well, sonnets are an integral part of culture, as is all literature, and because I'm sure you want to be a cultured individual who can hold intelligent conversation about something, beyond sports and reality television, you'll want to know about sonnets. The second question I get is, why must we know about the structure of a sonnet? Well, when you realize a poem is a sonnet, it is important that we identify all components and use them to our advantage to unravel the meaning of these often complex literary puzzles. The three basic components of a sonnet is, first, they must have 14 lines. Second, they must have a structured rhyme scheme. And third, they utilize iambic pentameter. I dare you to say iambic pentameter 3 times fast. Earlier, like 2 slides ago, I said that sonnet components can help us decipher the meaning. Sonnet themes tend to follow a general development that can be broken down based on the type of rhyme scheme and thus what kind of sonnet it really is. The two basic rhyme schemes are Shakespearean and Petrarchan. However, fun fact, Shakespeare did not actually create the rhyme scheme that he made famous. He simply made it famous. The Petrarchan sonnet was created by Francesco Petrarch way before Shakespeare was ever born. The Shakespearean rhyme scheme has an alternating rhyme that ends with a heroic couplet. Keeping in mind what we know about rhymes, that when we mark rhyme, we mark it to the right of the poem, we use capital letters, and we match those letters for the rhyme, we're going to mark this sonnet for rhyme scheme, so follow along with me. First, we have sun. That would be A. Then we have red, B. Then we have done, A. Head, B. Now, I want to note really quickly, we have an alternating pattern here, A, B, A, B. Next, we have white. That doesn't rhyme with anything, we have to move to the next letter, so C. Cheeks would be D, delight goes with white, so we have C, reeks and cheeks, D. Again, alternating C, D, C, D. Then we move on to know, which would be E, sound, which would be F, go, E, ground, F. Again, alternating, E, F, E, F. Finally, we have rare and compare, which don't rhyme with anything before it, so it is G, G. And no, I don't mean good game. Now, I want to go back up to the top. We had A, B, A, B. Let's mark those separately. Then we had C, D, C, D. Then E, F, E, F. And finally, GG. Now, the first 3 sections that I've marked here are 4 lines each. What we call these sections of 4 lines is quatrains. The last 2 lines are called heroic couplets. Now, these sections really do help us decide what the poem is saying. It helps us notice transition words, it helps us see where the theme is developed, and it helps us see where things change. Okay, I'm going to read this sonnet, and when I'm finished, I'm going to go back through and talk about how the theme is developed. Stick with me. My mistress' eyes are nothing like the sun. Coral is far more red than her lips red. If snow be white, why then her breasts are dun. If hairs be wires, black wires grow on her head. I have seen roses damasked, red and white, but no such roses see I in her cheeks. And in some perfumes is there more delight than in the breath that from my mistress reeks. I love to hear her speak, yet well I know that music hath a far more pleasing sound. I grant I never saw a goddess go. My mistress, when she walks, treads on the ground. And yet, by heaven, I think my love as rare as any she belied with false compare. Right, so this poem doesn't seem that flattering. I mean, after all, in the first 4 lines he is saying, yeah, her eyes aren't that great, her lips aren't that red, and honestly, she's got kind of ugly hair. But I want to point out a few things here. those first four lines don't have end punctuation until the last line, the fourth line. It has semicolons otherwise. One of the things I want to point out is there's a period here. That's significant. Now the next four lines continue this idea. I've seen roses damasked red and white, but no such roses see I in her cheeks. She doesn't have very flushed cheeks. I've smelled better things than her breath. Those are the next four lines, 5 through 8. On line 8, please note yet again, end punctuation. Then the next four lines, lines 9, 10, 11, and 12, also go kind of the same way. They're continuing to develop this idea. I'd love to hear her speak, but I've heard better things. She's not that great of a singer, and she's not really light on her feet. But again, look at the last line of this quatrain. It has a colon, which then leads us to the last two lines, which are actually quite sweet, where he says, "Yet by heaven I think my love is rare, as any she belied with false compare." Even though she's not all this idea of perfect gorgeousness, she is really special to me. So right there, in between lines 12 and 13, we see a shift. This shift is called two things: the turn or the volta. This gives us the resolution that we so desperately want in everything. We want resolution in our songs, we want resolution in our books, well, we want resolution to a conflict or a problem or an idea in a poem as well. The turn, or the volta, gives us that. I'd like to point out one more thing that helps us see this theme development, and that is transition words, particularly these words here, and yet. You will notice as you read through more and more sonnets that they tend to use transitional words that either help develop and complicate the problem in the three quatrains, or give us that resolution that we want in the last two lines, that heroic couplet. Okay, to review Shakespearean rhyme scheme, the basic rhyme scheme is A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, G, G. Again, when we group these, we have quatrain, 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 and a heroic couplet with the turn, or the volta, showing up right in between the last quatrain and the heroic couplet. The second rhyme scheme for sonnets is the Petrarchan sonnet. There are two basic things you need to remember about Petrarchan sonnets. The first one is an Abba rhyme scheme. I'll explain that in a minute. And the next one is a varied end pattern. Also, I'll explain that with an example in just a second. So, on this new poem, The New Colossus by Emma Lazarus, we're going to repeat what we did with the Shakespearean one and mark rhyme scheme. Now, it's not going to be the same as the Shakespearean one, though. First, we have fame. A. Then we have land, B, stand, B, and flame, A. Now I want to stop right there. Notice, on the last slide I said an Abba rhyme scheme. We already have that, A, B, B, A. Let's continue. Name, A, hand, B, command, B, frame, A. Let's stop again. We have this A, B, B, A, and then it repeats again, A, B, B, A. So the first 8 lines follow this very similar pattern. Let's look at the last 6 lines. She, C, poor, D, free, C, shore, D, me, C, and door, D. So the last 6 lines also follow this very particular structure of CD, CD, CD. So I'm going to mark very quickly the first 8 lines. These first 8 lines are called an octave. Then we have the last 6 lines, CD, CD, CD. This is called a sestet. Now, if you think back to the Shakespearean sonnets, in between the second to the last and the last section, that last quatrain and then the heroic couplet, we had the turn, or the volta. Well, that's very similar here, except we only have 2 sections. So our turn, or our volta, will go right here, in between lines 8 and 9. I'm now going to read the poem again. This time I want you to keep in mind where the end punctuation shows up for lines, and if you see any transitional ideas, phrases, or anything like that. Not like the brazen giant of Greek fame, with conquering limbs astride from land to land. Here at our sea-washed sunset gates shall stand a mighty woman with a torch, whose flame is the imprisoned lightning, and her name Mother of Exiles. From her beacon hand glows world-wide welcome. Her mild eyes command the air-bridged harbor that twin cities frame. Keep, ancient lands, your storied pomp, cries she with silent lips. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed, to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. So, I want to go back to the structure of this poem and think about how it develops this idea of the Statue of Liberty welcoming all of these immigrants to the United States. The first 8 lines truly sets this majestic, magisterial presence of this woman who's conquering lands and holding a torch, a mother of exiles. I want to note that at the end of our octave, there is an end punctuation, a period. So she's developed this idea of this beautiful woman. And then in the sestet, it changes a little bit. The tone goes from magisterial beauty to, you know what, those of you who are ancient, keep those. We don't want those. We want the people who want to come here and work, who want to try something new, who want to be successful. And it says, send these to me, and I will be their light. So we see on line 9 a turn, or a volta, that changes the tone of the poem and kind of answers the first 8 lines. This is what a Petrarchan sonnet does. It truly breaks down and develops an idea and then changes it in between lines 8 and 9 in that turn. As a review for the Petrarchan sonnet, we have another general rhyme scheme that we follow, and that is A, B, B, A, B, B, A, and then CD, CD, CD. Now, I do have to make a really important note here. There is a caveat to the last 6 lines. It did say a varied rhyme pattern for the end on that first slide for the Petrarchan sonnet. It's really important that you understand that this can change, the CD, CD, CD. It can sometimes be CDE, CDE. It can also sometimes be CD, CD, EE. It does change. Basically, what we're really looking for is an octave and a sestet with a turn right between them. So, now we've learned the 2 basic rhyme schemes and how they help develop theme. We also need to understand what iambic pentameter is when we talk about sonnets. And for some reason, when I do this, most students, they look like that hand down there trying to squish the happy face, but really, it's going to be a happy time. It's not as hard as it seems. The 2 basic things you have to keep in mind about iambic pentameter is that there are 10 syllables per line, pretty much no matter what, even though sometimes they cheat, and they alternate stressed and unstressed syllables, which I will explain on the next slide. Okay, so we have 2 different kinds of stresses when we talk about iambic pentameter. The first one is unstressed, which we will mark with a little U-shaped thing. We also have stressed syllables, which we will mark with a little dash. Now, iambic pentameter always starts with unstressed syllables, and then it alternates between unstressed and stressed for every syllable. That means you have to mark if a word has multiple syllables, such as the word unstressed. It has 2 syllables, un and stressed. So let's try and break down this line here. My mistress' eyes are nothing like the sun. First we have my. That's 1 syllable. We know we start with unstressed, so we're going to mark that. Then we have mistress. Well, that's 2 syllables, but we know we have to alternate. So the first syllable is the stressed, and the next one is unstressed. My mistress. Then the next one is eyes, stressed, are, unstressed, nothing, stressed, unstressed, like the sun. So I want to note a few things. We start unstressed and stressed, there's 1. Unstressed and then stressed, there's 2. Unstressed and stressed, there are 3. Unstressed and stressed, there's 4. And finally, 5. So we have 5 sets of this alternating pattern, unstressed, stressed, unstressed, stressed. We call these iambic feet, or quite simply, iambs. How many iambs do we have? Well, it's iambic pentameter, so we have 5. If I read this the way it's stressed, it would sound like this. My mistress' eyes are nothing like the sun. Now, of course, we don't read it that way, but when you start reading lines that have iambic pentameter, you start hearing this really nice flow and pattern that they have. We would just read it as, my mistress' eyes are nothing like the sun. But you would start catching this really lovely sound that shows up in any poetry that uses meter. On these 4 lines, I want to practice a little bit more with iambic pentameter, and I also want to give you a few tips as to how to be successful, and some of the cheats that poets will do as well. So, on this first line, I just want to give you a tip. If iambic pentameter is kind of tricky for you, you're not sure where to break syllables, then just go through and break down the syllables first. So if I do this, I could say I, that's 1. Grant is 1 syllable. I, again, 1 syllable. Never, though, is 2 syllables. So I would put never. Saw is 1. A is 1. Goddess is 2. And go. Now, this really helps some students who struggle breaking down syllables, and that's great, and I want you to do this if it's good for you. However, you do still have to mark the actual iambic pentameter, the stressed and unstressed syllables. So you would then need to go through and say, I grant, I never saw a goddess go. That gives us 5 iambs, if I break them down here, and thus iambic pentameter. On the next line, I'm just going to go through and mark the iambic pentameter. My mistress, when she walks, treads on the ground. That's great. I have 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 iambs, or iambic feet. This next line is really tricky, and this is one of those cheats that a lot of poets put in, not just Shakespeare. Let's count these syllables. And yet, by heaven, I think my love as rare. Now, as I was saying that, you may have caught at the end, like, oh, that doesn't really sound right. And if you look at this, the problem we have is that we have 11 syllables, not 10. And our tricky word here is the word heaven. Now, what Shakespeare more than likely wanted us to do was to pronounce it as 1 syllable instead of 2. The typical shortening for this is to drop that second E, so sometimes it's spelled this way. Heaven. And they'll put that little apostrophe there to say, yeah, I know there's an E, but who needs it? I want 1 syllable, yo. I just said yo. That was embarrassing. Anyway, now I'm going to ignore the fact that heaven has 2 syllables, and I'm just going to mark it as 1. So it would look like this. And yet, by heaven, I think my love as rare. It sounds a little silly, but it does work. He needed to use the word heaven, and there's not really a good 1-syllable word to use as a synonym. Now the next line is your basic 10-syllable line again. As any she belied with false compare. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 feet or iambs. Thus we have iambic pentameter. Whew. Well, you made it through my little video about Shakespearean sonnets, Petrarchan sonnets, and iambic pentameter. As a quick review, all sonnets have 14 lines. They must have a very strict rhyme scheme. One of them is Shakespearean, where it follows ABAB, CDCD, EF, GG, making it 3 quatrains and 1 heroic couplet at the end. There's also the Petrarchan sonnet, which follows the ABBA, CD rhyme scheme, 1 octave, 1 sestet. Really quick side note, sometimes that CD can change. There are turns or voltas within those rhyme schemes, and that theme development and resolution is created through the rhyme scheme. And then finally we have the iambic pentameter, where each line in a sonnet has 10 syllables per line, with 5 that are unstressed and 5 stressed. It begins with an unstressed syllable, and then we alternate between unstressed and stressed, giving us a total of 5 iambs or iambic feet. Now, I want to point out that on Monday, when we come back to class, you will be expected to practice applying some of this knowledge. If you want to get a little practice at home on your own, I will post one sonnet that you can go through and play with a little bit on your own. You can come back with questions on Monday. If you have any questions that you think could be answered really quickly, you could always email me at rsimmons1@usd259.net. I look forward to talking to you about this. I hope that you think this is really interesting and different and something new that you've never learned before. Thanks for being awesome, and continue to be awesome.